little bit short of 10 minutes, but I had really compressed what I wanted to say down into that really short time. Generally, those statements inspire a lot of questions in Q&A, and I want to make sure we've got time to answer questions.
That's fantastic. I mean, I wish it was a positive message, but it's the truth, and that's what we have to deal with as we move on. So again, thank you, Andrea, and we'll be back to you. Our next plenary speaker is going to be Shanique Rodriguez. Many of you know her as Shanique Spalding, so we have to congratulate her because she's just recently been married. And so I've outed you, Shanique. And you're a political, social, and reproductive justice activist who's been organizing people in BIPOC communities across Massachusetts. She's the executive director of the Massachusetts Voters Table, and the MVT advances civic access, engagement, and representation to increase resources and power for people of color and working class people toward achieving a multiracial democracy. Shanique, welcome, and you're on.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Henry, for the well wishes. And for those of you who are saying congratulations in the chat, I deeply appreciate it. As Henry said, my name is Shanique Spalding. I have she pronouns, but now Shanique Rodriguez. I would like to just talk a little bit about some problems that I've identified and some of the work that the Voter Table is doing to address some of these problems, but also want to just uplift it in this space for further discussion. So want to cover building trust in marginalized communities as one, very similar to what Andrea was saying, and then also cover funding the work. So one of the clear issues that we are seeing now that are obstacles is that we have trust building to do in marginalized community, low income and BIPOC communities, because voter turnout has consistently been low these past few years. Before I jump into the problem, I want to talk a little bit about the Massachusetts Voter Table. For those of you who may not know or maybe zooming in from out of state, the Massachusetts Voter Table is an affiliate organization to the national organization called State Voices. The Voter Table seeks to advance civic access, engagement, and representation to increase resources and power for people of color and working class people towards achieving a multiracial democracy. So we are a statewide coalition of community organizations, and we work with those community organizations. We have about 50 at our table by providing coaching, training, and guidance and data-driven field strategies. So to address some problems. So building trust in marginalized communities in a divided political two-party system. Like Andrea said before, we are seeing low voter turnouts across the state of Massachusetts, and particularly in our marginalized communities. Andrea is absolutely right that voter turnouts are low, and it's not something just impacting Virginia. It impacts Massachusetts and a number of states nationwide. In the last 8 years, it's clear that the generational and the general shift of sentiments of the base around politics have shifted. I recently read an article in Pew Research Center saying that 65% of Americans say that they always or often feel exhausted when thinking about politics. And by contrast, just 10% say that they always or often feel hopeful about politics. And so you see that we have a large community of folks, marginalized or not, who feel sort of burnt out or feel overwhelmed when thinking about politics and policy. But this is a problem that we not just see on the nation-wide landscape. We're also seeing that in our communities in Massachusetts. Just last year in 2022, we saw overall in Massachusetts an increase in voter turnout. But when you look at our gateway cities, our larger marginalized communities, we saw that 20 of those had the worst voter turnout somewhere between 20 and 30%. That's significantly lower than what you saw as the statewide average. We gave ourselves a pat on the back saying that, yeah, we had large voter turnout, but you look down community by community, you're seeing that some of our largest communities have really low voter turnout, even in a statewide election where there's a gubernatorial race. So how do we build trust in communities who no longer have faith in election process and individuals who are running? I say the way that we do that is the way the voter table approaches this work, which is getting back to the basics, finding community leaders, trusted activists, and community organizations to be your messengers in the grassroots work. At the voter table, we consist of community orgs in these same communities that have low voter turnout. And the hope is that these are the organizations that's going to be doing year-round civic engagement. So voters aren't just seeing you on election day or election cycles, they're talking to someone throughout the year, engaging around what's happening in their community, what's happening statewide, and what's happening nationally. It's important that the people that they talk to every day are people that they know live in their community, have relationships with them, whose children go to the same schools as them. And that's really important when you think about a community that often feels left behind in politics and policy. How many times have we heard people say things like, oh, I only know what's going on when it's election season, or I only ever see my elected official during an election cycle? That's the core issue and the problem of why communities like our marginalized communities, our low income and BIPOC communities, don't trust the political structure, because we often are not a part of the conversation. We're often not sought out to speak about policy and politics until it's time to elect someone. Then the other problem that I've identified is funding and sort of the shift for our organizations from doing civic engagement work or democracy work to doing service-based work. What I mean by this is that after the 2020 pandemic, many of our grassroots organizations shifted to service work, which makes sense. I think we all sort of pivoted during that time to do census work and to do redistricting and to do COVID-19 outreach work. It was necessary. When we saw how much our communities of color were impacted, a lot of our organizations in those communities shifted to do that work long term. And national funders were all in. They were funding COVID-19 work. They were funding census work, and grassroots organization got resources and funding, ARPA money. Small businesses were staying open because of money coming through government release. We saw money for COVID testing. We saw money for COVID clinics. All of those things came during 2020 and then slowly dissipated after. But during that time when people couldn't knock on doors or do traditional outreach for democracy, they shifted to be service-oriented organizations, specifically also because of the lack of resources were coming to our communities during that time. Alternatively, before the pandemic, we saw a lot of resources go into democracy, specifically around the time that Trump got elected. People became really loud about democracy. People got really scared about the route that it was heading to. And we saw C3 and C4 dollars just flood grassroots organizations, organizations on the national level, and organizations within the state. But again, 8 years later, we saw that funding slowly dissipate. And that slow dissipation happened with voter sentiments, right? Because as people got less engaged or feeling more overwhelmed about the politics or the infighting between Democrats with Democrats, progressives and liberals, and anti-Trump and Trump Republicans, it became so fraught that even the voters themselves and the funders were starting to feel withdrawn from it. But the problem with civic engagement work, especially marginalized communities, is that oftentimes there's not enough organizations doing this work of talking to our most marginalized people. And we rely on those funding, including the voter table, to receive that funding. And often what is happening now in 2023 is that we are funding what is hot and sexy right now. We are funding battleground states, because there's a lot of focus on what's happening around voting rights there. So we see national funders and even our own Massachusetts funders shifting to giving money to those states and taking their eye off of Massachusetts or their own state, if we want to be a little bit more broader on this. And the problem with that is that once we start to shift away and only work on particular hot button issues, we start to lose the momentum that we've built over a long period of time of doing this work of civic engagement. But I'm also just thinking about how do we solve that problem where funders aren't funding the space anymore and organizations are shifting from doing civic engagement work to do service work. Because if there's anything, there's always going to be money to do homeless prevention work. There's always going to be money to do healthcare work. There'll always be sort of service-oriented funding, but never enough funding for democracy. And it's simply because we are losing ground somewhere between national politics and our local politics. And we need to go back to the basics. We need to start talking about the issues that impact people and tying the funding and the work around the issues and less about the people who are running or the government systems or the parties, because I think that that's where we start getting lost in the weeds and we see our funders sort of shifting the same way. So love to talk more with you all about that. So I want to just make sure, I think I'm at time now for 10 minutes. So I want to leave space for follow-up of questions. So more to come on that. Henry.
Right. Thank you, Shanique, and we'll get back to you and Andrea. But first, we're going to hear from Nikki Osborne. And Nikki retired relatively recently. She was then the commissioner of the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission, but she remained very active, going on to work as an election strategist for candidates across the country. So lots of electoral experience. She is going to speak about her current work in Southeast Massachusetts, organizing against MAGA groups and activists who run for school boards with funding from major right-wing organizations across the country. She'll tell us about the extent of this MAGA threat in Massachusetts and suggest some strategies that she knows have been effective. Nikki, welcome. You're muted, Nikki.
Thank you very much, Henry. It's a pleasure to be here and speaking with you about this very important issue. I'm starting to work with a group of South Coast communities in really working together and collaborating on how to beat back the MAGA forces. In 2023, I was a campaign manager for a candidate who was running for re-election, Frances Kearns, and she had a MAGA candidate as a challenger, as did one of the other members of the committee. And we had to really figure out strategies about how best to ensure that our candidates won. And also, we worked very closely with Rochester and Marion as the three towns grouped together to form the old Rochester Regional School that includes both the junior high and high school. So we had a lot in common and really wanting to make sure that our candidates won. In Rochester, there were two candidates who were already considered to be MAGA candidates, and they just really wanted to maintain their position and not get knocked out of the race. And so what we did in Mattapoisett is really developed a very strategic plan to target specific people who we felt we could get their votes. We had volunteers, of course, that went out and canvassed and phone banked and did all the usual kinds of campaign work that we actually talked about in our previous session. And we think that that really made a difference. Backing up for a minute and looking sort of at the big picture, the American Library Association has done a survey, and they found that basically most people don't want books banned from their libraries, that they believe that most people really trust and believe in their librarians and support them. So it's this vocal minority that gets a lot of attention. And in spite of all of this and the support, there were 2,571 unique titles last year that were targeted to be removed from libraries. So it shows you that there's a lot of concern about this issue, and it gets vocalized in little small pockets throughout the state. And I'll speak to that in just a minute. So in Mattapoisett, in September, there was this buzz going on that there were going to be books that were going to get banned, and nobody was doing anything about it. And people were just sitting around and being concerned about which books were going to get banned. And Montero, one of the school committee members who was again on the panel that we just had, decided that he wanted to bring this motion up for review and really find out what the decision was going to be. And really, he was supporting the books, but to stay in the library, but he really wanted, he was on a quest for transparency is what he said. And so the library went through a process, and the school and the school committee went through a process that was spelled out in their policy and procedure manual. And in fact, the books were allowed to remain in the library for the next 3 years. Okay, fast forward then to May, when we have the town elections. And that's when we have the MAGA candidates who are very concerned about these books. We have one guy who has written books on how the clergy were wrongly accused of abusing children, and saying that Genderqueer is a book of just filth and dirt and shouldn't be included in any library. And we have another MAGA candidate who is the director of a day program who has serious allegations of abuse that don't get handled in the correct way. And he says he's running for the safety of the children. So we have these conflicts, and at the end of the day, the public chose. But I think that what this does say is that the issues out there are real, that we're very concerned about how these organizations are getting funded. And so while there wasn't the money in Mattapoisett, in Rochester, our neighboring town, there were actually 2 ways of funding that they received that we hadn't anticipated and we knew nothing about. So one was the Independent Expenditure PAC that was started up by a local resident and a man who's a treasurer from, I think he lived in California. And it was called the Rochester Citizens for Responsible Government. And it was founded for the purpose of participating in the electoral process. The local resident threw $20,000 at the cause, and at the end of the day spent about $10,000 on palm cards and flyers and all the things that Francis did through fundraising. But this was done by a local resident who was able to pull together this money on her own and make this happen. The more insidious group, however, is the Massachusetts Family Institute, MFI. So it's according to its website, it's a nonprofit policy group dedicated to strengthening and the family and affirming Judeo-Christian values upon which it's based. It's a 501c3 organization, which means that it should not be doing any kind of national or candidate canvassing or working collaboratively with candidates to support their efforts. And in fact, this issue was raised with the state, and to this date, nothing has happened with that. The Massachusetts Family Institute, in fact, gave money for training on how to do canvassing, and they offered their services if they needed any legal advice for future complaints against the regional high school. According to our local newspaper, between 2015 and 2019, tax records revealed that MFI collected over $2.7 million in gift contribution and fees, another $100,000 the following year, another $700,000 the year after that. So they have a lot of money that they're distributing. They're getting a data bank set up to look at what sex education is getting taught in all the schools in Massachusetts. They were involved in a reading of books to children at local libraries in Mattapoisett. They sent out a flyer that looked like the Mattapoisett Public Library was going to be holding this reading for young kids and their parents. And in fact, there were 2 books that were read that were what many would consider to be we're racist, and we're anti-LGBTQ, and really just very inappropriate. So we say, okay, you got to be careful, because in some ways they can come in the back door, and you don't know that you don't have Mr. Rogers sitting there, but you have somebody else who's going to give you a very different story. So it's important to know where people are getting their money. I think what we learned in 2023 was that the right is organized, it is funded, and they'll spend money where they think they can win. And they thought they at least wanted to maintain their stronghold in Rochester, and thought they might be able to win in Mattapoisett, but weren't able to. That campaigns have to have really a pathway to victory. They need to know how they're going to win and have a clear strategy and move in that direction. You talk about marginalized people and how they're being discouraged from voting, and that's true in local communities too. Mattapoisett is pretty much 99% white, but we only had 30% of the people vote in this municipal election. And so we have to get out there, and that's one of the things that we're doing right now, is getting out and providing educational forums for people to come in and talk, and try to get more people engaged at this point in December, January, so that when we start in full going out canvassing and really trying to support candidates, that we've laid the groundwork, and that we've begun to develop some relationships with other people, and trying to really grow our volunteer base. Because at the end of the day, we don't have the money, and the far right puts the money where they think they can get the most out of it. So we are especially aware of first-time candidates who need help in running, and we want to be supportive of them. And we need to support legislation such as the one filed by, I think it's Representative Oliveira, who has filed a bill for under HD 443 to say that libraries cannot ban books unless they've followed the American Library Association guidelines. And so that's a really important piece of legislation that needs to get followed, that people can do. I think that what you can do as next steps is really looking at, I'm just checking my time, understand if MAGA is at work in your community. Really look at how these candidates are being funded. See if you can collaborate with other communities around you. That we really need to share in our resources, not necessarily financial, because there will never be enough and people are going to have to hold on to their own. But you can share in terms of skill building, and you can share in terms of trainings. I can do a training on Vote Builder for one community or 6 communities. It doesn't make any difference. Through Zoom, we can make that happen. So we need to figure out ways that we can work together and really share in our resources. And I think that's really across the state. There's no reason why we have to keep it localized. That we really need to support our progressive candidates to win, and to see how best you can really join in and help. As a little piece of gossip, I read that Governor DeSantis made an unannounced visit to an annual fundraising dinner at MFI on October 13th. So I'm glad he's alive and well in the state, and he kind of sneaks in and out, and that's the feeling that you get this whole with MAGA, is that you have to really keep your ear to the ground and know what you're dealing with, because at the end of the day, they got a lot of money to throw at their resources. So thank you very much. I hope that was helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So thank you, Nikki. So people have heard what's going on in the Southeast. There are other examples in the middle of the state, and people, if you have questions, please indicate that in the chat, and once we get through the questions, I hope we have time for cross discussion. Jeff, I see your hand. You're muted, Jeff.
Oh, let me unmute Jeff 1 second. Okay.
First off, Cole, you're right. That is a habit that's distracting, and I did put in the chat box about asking how I could asking how do I fix it, and do you have an answer to the question?
Why don't you
That other one?
ask your
Yeah.
question, Jeff?
All right. And secondly, why do you say that you're glad Ron DeSantis is alive? I prefer him if he's not run for office at all, because he's a fascist. You know?
Right. Thank you, Jeff. Martha, I see your hand.
I have a question for actually any of the three panelists. I think it is Andrea that mentioned that you're working with faith-based organizations. And one of my questions is what experience you all have in, doing sort of vote-based, more political work, working with faith-based organizations. How does that work out for you?
We are very, very close to our faith-based partners, and they have been our partners, some of them since 2018, and the rest came on in 2020. What we are not allowed to do as a 501c3 is to tell people to vote for or against a candidate. So what we do is we make sure that voters are informed about when, where, and how they can vote, and the issues that are currently in that election based on the offices that are in the election. So in the Virginia election, abortion was on the ballot, voting rights was on the ballot. So that is what we talk to people about, not about candidates per se. We give people that yardstick. So there is an election and your yardstick. This is what's really going to be impacted by this election. And then people could look at the candidates. Do I believe this candidate is going to be supporting my beliefs on reproductive rights? And when we go to the federal election for older voters, we will be talking about Social Security, Medicare, voting rights for all voters, and reproductive rights, because that is really what people are voting for. We work to take voting out of this I'm voting for prom king kind of atmosphere where people start dealing with personalities, as opposed to these people are going to have votes that are going to impact your lives on these issues. Who do you think is going to represent you best?
Thank you. Ron, did you want to get a question in? Ron, you're muted if you want to get a question. All right. So, Jonathan, you're muted. Yep.
Thanks.
Sorry, Henry.
Hi,
I'm going to be
Andrea.
on mute.
Welcome. Thanks, Nikki. Those are very valuable. I worked with the Poor People's Campaign on the voter registration campaign in the last election. And one of the things we were struck by is in how many, even 160 state rep districts, the vast majority of the state reps, state senator running unopposed. So very hard to convince a voter that their vote is really going to make a difference when there was no choice. And in our mass progressive action organizing table leading up to this conference, one of the things we've talked about is the need to retreat and rebuild the kind of the bench thing, and to find candidates who will run in a primary against an incumbent so that the voters will have a choice. Because if the voters don't have a choice they're not going to believe you're not telling the truth when you tell them, well, your vote really matters. So I think it's really important that we recognize the need to find local candidates who will run in a primary and challenge an incumbent.
We actually teach candidates how to run for office. So we make sure they understand the basics. And as I said, one of our Democracy Center leaders is running for Congress. So what does your community need? Write it down. This is what my community wants. Then you take that to people that are elected. This becomes your demand for your community. If the elected are willing to work on it, great. You've got a good person. If not, you've got to get somebody else to run for that seat. And as we tell our leaders and our folks, it might very well be you.
Wanted to comment on that as well, Jonathan. I think you're absolutely right. Building the bench is very important. People are missing options, but I think often when we talk about building the bench, people think about those statewide races, those national seats, but it really has to start on the grassroots level, on the municipal level, school committee, city councilor, mayors, because those are the folks who then feel confident enough to run for statewide races. The problem is there's not enough investment in those municipal elections, and they're often very sleepy because of different nuances of how those elections are run town by town. But it's really where we have to put our eye when we're thinking about building the bench. One of our partners at the voter table is Lowell Votes. They actually do some in the North Shore, they have some candidates training, and the candidates training is really what they do is identify in community leaders, people that people talk about that are activist community leaders, and they have a program that is really training them up for if they wanted to consider running for an office, what that work would look like specifically in community. So if you wanted to run for school committee, mayor, all of that, what do they do? What is the process? And they actually have guest speakers from those seats come and speak. They have had more people run for municipal office who have graduated from that program than people who have not. So I think it's a really stellar program. We actually had them come and do a presentation at our all partner meeting for the rest of our partners to see if any of our other community groups would be interested in creating a program like that within their community. And I think that's a really great way of trying to build a bench. Is really part of the fear is I don't actually know what I'm doing, especially when it comes to women, right? Like there's this concept that we need to know all of the things and be qualified for all of the things in order for us to run. So if we think we don't know what they do, we are less likely to run, even if people think you're the best activist in community and you always show up to the meetings, clearly you should run. I think that that is really important. If we do more educational events about what these elected positions do and how to run for office, I think that'll really be the catalyst for building the bench, and that we start right here at home when we do that.
Yeah, and what I might add too is just in the session that I had before this, we had one on running for an office, and it was a broad overview, but we thought locally, I did this with a couple of the folks that ran for school committee. We're gonna take this on the road. We're gonna try to hold some forums and invite people to come, or to your idea of really looking at who are already sort of natural leaders and get them to come and hear what it takes to run for an office and what the job actually is. I think the point is well taken. If you have a mega candidate who you're running against, however, it's a little more likely to get somebody because the competition becomes really a little bit greater. So it helps. It can hurt, but it can help,
All right. So Ron, I think you're unmuted, and then we'll go to Russell.
Thank you for unmuting me. It's a question for all of the speakers. We could have an entire multi-hour session on the strategic ways to get more people involved in the voting process and to have trust in government and all other fun, good stuff. And frankly, I'd love to have any of you be part of such a thing. But I am involved in elections. I'm a precinct warden myself, and I've been working this for 6 years. And I definitely see the patterns. The lower they are on the socioeconomic scale, the less likely they are to show up in a voting booth, even though they're the people who need to vote more than anybody else. And so the question I've got for you guys is, strategic success, wonderful. Do we have anything that you've done that's tactical, that works to get out the vote on voting day, that you've seen work with better percentages than other things? Because this past election, we had less than 10% voter participation, and we even vote by mail. We had the lowest percentage participation in vote by mail than we've put in. We've got automatic voter registration. We held elections 8 weeks early. We did everything that we could think of, and we got less than 10% voter. So I'm looking for ideas here.
I love what you're saying. We were like that in Virginia. Our last election, I believe they said we had 41% participation in the election, and our 2023 elections were state only elections. And in Virginia, in several communities, we literally asked people to vote 6 times because we had so many special elections. What we do, number one, we make sure people have the information, where to vote, when to vote. We did work in Georgia, and we did a survey, or the NAACP did a survey in 2020 of people who did not vote in the 2020 election or the runoff. These were Black voters. 3 main reasons were, number one, I didn't know where the voting was. Number 2, I couldn't get there. And number 3, and it was a distant third, I didn't like any of the candidates.
Danica, Nikki, do you want to get in on that?
I can jump in. A couple things I'll say here is that nothing that any of us is going to say should be for this group new. I think all the tactics work depending on the community, right? First of all, is understanding where you're doing outreach in. First of all, is going to help us decide what tactics work best. So I'm going to speak from an example of something I talked about in my overview, which is funding. So because we knew democracy funding in Massachusetts wasn't pooled, wasn't actually going to community organizations that are doing this work, part of the thing that the voter table has is a program called Democracy Hubs. So members of our table can join the Democracy Hubs program, which gives them regional connection between different organizations in their region to specifically do civic engagement work to turn out voters in low propensity voter areas. In that program, we also provide funding. Last election, 2022, we provided 1.4 million to about 35 organizations who participated in that. Specifically, La Colaborativa in Chelsea did civic engagement work during last election cycle. We saw that they had done at least 3 touches to voters in those communities, and they used that specific funding to fund their actual organizer in-house and also to pay for paid organizers, specifically youth organizers. So going back to Jonathan's question about building the bench for organizers is important as well, who did voter outreach during that time for a number of things that were happening in the election cycle last year. We saw that even though overall there was a low voter turnout in Chelsea, what we did see is that the number of people who turned out in Chelsea was equal to that of the number of people that La Colaborativa has spoken to that day. So it really goes to show that when we are hyper-focused on different wards, precincts, or bodies of people, and we do a number of touches to those same people, very similar to what Andrea is talking about, 6 touches, is that correlates to actual voter turnout. It's not so much about we tell everyone once or twice a year that an election is happening, is that we go back and back and back. Again, nothing new, but the data just showed that our organizations statewide during that election cycle, every single one of them who did 3 touches to the list that they reached out to, all of those people voted. So it's about the quantity of times that we go speak to a voter in a year that's going to see some real turnout. But again, Rome wasn't built in a day, and I'm trying to encourage my organizations to just focus on blocks, precincts, wards. That's how we're going to see the trickle effect where we see the overall. And they can also measure their success, because it's easy to say, like, we knocked 10,000 doors in the city of Springfield, Worcester, Boston. But in the grand scheme of things, you're still going to see a low voter turnout for the whole entire city. But if you run that down to 10,000 people in a single precinct, that's a different turnout. And over time, you can build that up. So it's going to take us time, right? This that has happened in our democracy did not happen in a wave overnight. That was a slow burning fire that just took off at one point. And now we're here where we are. And we have to build that up brick by brick, mortar by mortar.
Thank you, Shani.
I think
Nikki?
that's a great point. And I think that it shows the need for research of what works for different populations. It shows having somebody like you who can really analyze the data and to have it come back and say, okay, this is what this is saying, that we knocked these 1,000 doors and we got 1,000 people that were out, and we gave them, you had 6 touches. That's really important data that a lot of campaigns don't have access to, or they don't know how to use that kind of information. And that's an area, again, where we can share, is that, once you have the data, you can plug it into any kind of template and be able to produce that kind of dashboard for yourself that will really monitor how you all are doing. So I think it's I always go back to collaborations, and more that we can do, the better, because none of us have enough resources.
Thank you. Thank you all. Russell, here's your time.
Yeah, I have a quick question for Andrea. Andrea, it's a treat to see you again. I haven't seen you in 10
Hey,
years.
Russell.
So it's really nice to see you again. You mentioned something about 15 Democrats that were running unopposed in Virginia. And I'm wondering, is it the same for the Republicans? And
No.
Why?
No.
How would you characterize the difference as to why they're unopposed Democrats? And are they opposed Republicans, or are they unopposed Republicans?
It used to be in Virginia that we would have 15 to 25 Republicans unopposed. In 2017, we were down 15 seats in the Virginia State House. We won 14 of those seats in the 2017 election and lost 1 seat by 1 vote. So what we are seeing with the people who have been elected is they have been going out and being among their voters, and their voters are getting to know them. So we're not seeing people on the other side run against them, even in some districts where in 2015, this was a Republican district. Now, Virginia just finally, in this 2023 election, people ran in their redistricted seats. Whenever we redistrict in Virginia, even though it's a citizen redistricting committee, by the time the lawsuits are all settled, we generally end up a whole cycle between when people run in their new seats. So some of the Democrats are doing a much better job, and our General Assembly is getting younger. In 2017, Russell, you would have been one of the younger people in our GA. Our General Assembly, the average age after this election in 2023 dropped 25 years. 1/4 of the Virginia House is now Black, and we've got 7 Black Virginia senators. 5 of them were elected in 2023.
Well done. Thank you.
Very interesting. So here's a question, and this has to do with proposals about changing some of the election rules. Excuse me. And the question is, would that help in voter turnout? And what I mean by that is people are advocating for ranked choice voting, which I think is a great thing. And the question is, would that make any difference in terms of turnout? And a different proposal, it would be to get rid of our traditional primaries and have primaries basically that are independent of party, but the top 2 or 3 candidates, whoever they are, wind up being in the final election. And those have been proposed as one way of getting out turnout. And I just wonder if you think there's any substance to those arguments.
I'll jump in, even though I see Andrea reacting. I'll go first. I'll say a couple things. Top 5 and ranked choice votings are great voting systems for those who understand it. We have, a top 5 method in some of our municipal elections where we have a bunch of candidates run. You select, your top 5, in the primary, and then they go on to the general, and then you'll select however many city council members, for example, needs to. I live in a top 5 city when it comes to municipal elections. So they work. I would say the problem that ranked choice voting always has is how to explain it in the most simplistic way to voters. But the problem isn't the systems to vote, right? It's sort of the desire to vote. Because if the desire was up, we would all be voting. And then this conversation would really be about, okay, how do we make the voting process more streamlined? But I think the conversation at hand that we're seeing is people aren't going to the ballot box. So changing the ballots doesn't necessarily make people go to the ballot box. I don't think that solves the real core issue. I think we are putting more access out there, and I think that that's really helpful. And we have to do sort of both of those things. But I think the core issue is that people aren't going to the ballot box. So changing the voting process, I don't think necessarily inspires people to go to the ballot box. I think it's all the things that we've talked about at the top of this hour, which is, the people who are running and the issues we are talking about are really what drives people to the ballot box. And at that driving is where we analyze, okay, who didn't have access that wanted to? What can we change to fix that? Who got to the ballot box and couldn't vote because they didn't understand the ballot, and fix that? But I think it's the chicken and egg conversation. I think where do we start is really at the core of why aren't people utilizing all of these opportunities for access.
Andrea, do you want to add? I know you had a comment in the chat, but do you want to?
Oh yeah, I'm getting all over the place. In the chat, I hate ranked choice voting in communities of color because, exactly as Shanique said, people don't understand it. And they're just, oh my God, what do I do? We don't teach civics. We don't teach what ranked choice voting is. And in the couple of communities that have attempted it, it really hasn't gone well. What does work very, very well is early voting and same-day registration, especially in states. Figure all states south of Virginia kick people off the rolls for not voting. So if you don't vote as often as your state believes you should vote, then they're going to just dump you off the rolls. We really reach out to those voters that are 0 for 3 that are in danger of being dumped off the rolls rather than doing voter registration. We are trying to get new voters who are just going to get dumped off the rolls in 8 years for not voting. We try to help people understand, look, this is the way the system works. Voting is not a right. Would be nice if it was. It isn't. It's an ability. And like any ability, you don't use it, you're going to lose it. And people are like, whoa. And like nobody ever explained that to me before. Well, all right, this is the reality that we're working with. We're working to change it, but it hasn't changed yet. So I believe in being really honest with people about what they are dealing with. Oh yeah, I'm seeing in the chat people saying my vote doesn't matter. Nobody would ever say that in Virginia, because in Virginia we lost control of the Virginia General Assembly by one vote. I hear that nonsense, and our response is, we lost control of the General Assembly by one vote. Would that have been you? People are like, what? If your vote didn't matter, why are so many people trying to stop you from doing it? And that gets people thinking. The young people that were on our phones, most of them were not consistent voters. One of them wasn't registered. Now it is a requirement in order to work for us. You must be a registered voter, and we look. Because you're helping other people vote, and you need to be a part of it yourself. So there's just so much to unpack. And again, not everybody has the same privileges as other people. And many of us come to this call with a lot of privilege. We have the privilege of money. We have the privilege of education. And we deal with voters who don't.
Right.
I just wanted to pick up on what Andrea.
Nikki, go.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up quickly on what Andrea mentioned, but just spend a little more time on it, is not teaching any of this in our schools. I mean, it's incredible. I was talking with a high school kid the other day, and I said, do you have any civics classes that have been taught? And she said, well, there was an elective, but nobody ever takes that class. You know, and this needs to start in kindergarten. I mean, our local Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, Massachusetts, has a wonderful curriculum for each age group of what they can be taught. It's all there, and I don't know who's using it, but it's not a requirement. And I think yes, we need to do all these things in between to try to increase the voter turnout, but if it's not even part of our everyday life, it's just once a year, your parents go off and they cast a vote. And what does that mean? Or the kid gets, goes with them to the polls. It's not going to make the difference that really education does. And I think that is a place that really needs more emphasis.
Virginia, as a lifetime felony disenfranchisement state, is a state where a number of people never had the privilege of seeing their parents go off and vote because they couldn't vote.
So, Andrea, thank you. Nikki, thank you. Shanique, thank you. These are problems that don't have simple fixes, which you've all emphasized, but if they are to be fixed, they not only have to be faced, but they have to be faced day to day and over years. This is not something that we can turn around on a dime and say, done. And so we've got to take these lessons home with us and start working on them in each of our communities. So again, thank you, panel members. Really appreciate it. I know there were some questions that we couldn't get to, but we'll come back to these issues in the future. So now we're going to have our last plenary speaker, and I'm going to turn it over to Russell, who will provide us with, I'm sorry, Cole.
I think it's me, right?
Yeah, Cole will provide us with an introduction.
Okay, thanks, Henry. So we've talked about the Gaza crisis today and the very large peace movement that has sprung up in the last 2 months to address it. We have a special presentation tonight by Max Elbaum. Graham, could you put him on the spotlight? He has an article out called Palestine Solidarity and the Fight Against MAGA. Max is he's on the editorial board of Convergence magazine, where you can read that article. And he's also got a version of the article up on the Nation website as of today. And he's co-editor with Linda Burnham and Maria Publitt of power concedes nothing how grassroots organizing wins elections. Without further ado, Max Elbaum.
Thanks everybody for making the space for this discussion. I was able to sit in on the last few minutes of that workshop and it seemed right on point. Thank you very much to all who are participating in that. The Hamas attack, Israeli response, and the Biden response has dramatically changed the landscape that we're functioning in now. First, there's a tremendous amount of pain, suffering, grief, and rage spreading not just in Israel, Palestine, but out from there across the globe, including with many people here in the United States on all sides. Right now, with Israel restarting its military action, we're witnessing what amounts to mass murder, with some of the Israeli leadership openly speaking in genocidal terms. The danger of this war continuing for months and months or spreading throughout the Middle East is present at every moment. And this crisis has also upended US politics. Biden's embrace of Israel has made him a symbol of what Israel is doing in Gaza, and it has deeply alienated extremely important components of the coalition against Trump and the MAGA drive for authoritarian rule. In the Arab and Muslim communities, but not only in the Arab and Muslim communities, especially among young people, especially among young African Americans. There's an increasing identification with the struggle in Palestine for equal rights as part of the worldwide struggle for racial justice against white supremacy. And there's all kinds of evidence that not just voters, but organizers who threw down in 2020 and 2022 against MAGA have decided that a moral line has been crossed and they're not prepared to work for or vote for President Biden in 2024.
Thanks.
So this makes our tasks, this is a big challenge to our tasks. And we need an approach that fights for an immediate ceasefire, a durable ceasefire, that advances a change in US policy toward Israel-Palestine, and at the same time makes that struggle integral to the fight against MAGA in the 2024 elections. That Cole referred to, I wrote a piece in Convergence, and Bill Fletcher and I wrote a piece that was posted on The Nation yesterday that offers some ideas of how to strategize and act so that the struggle for Palestine is advanced and that it's coordinated with and becomes an integral part of the struggle against MAGA. The steps there include the kind of continuing grassroots mass action, but also an electoral component, which is essential. All those elected officials who've come out for a ceasefire, trying to minimize the representation in Congress of the diehard opponents of the ceasefire, and also taking some moves to see if we can get Biden to step down in favor of a candidate who would be more able to unite all segments of the anti-MAGA coalition to victory in 2024. So I'm going to say a few things about the landscape just going into 2020 before October 7th, some of the key developments since October 7th, and then I'm going to say a little bit more about the strategic ideas that we're advancing here. Two important points about before October 7th. One, there's been a steady shift over the last few years among the base of the Democratic Party and among youth, younger people in general, toward more sympathy with Palestine than with Israel in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Between 2021 and 2023, for the first time in the Democratic base, according to the polls, there's more sympathy for the Palestinian side than the Israeli side, by 49% to 38%. This is a huge change in a country where the support for Israel has been sort of a third rail, almost a religious thing in American politics. You can get more trouble in American politics if you stand up and say Palestine belongs to the Palestinians than if you say we should give California and Texas back to Mexico. The second thing is that, as we all know, there have been big differences in the coalition that has come to take shape in the fight against Trump and Trumpism. And the heart of the most fraught differences have been over foreign policy. Many in the progressive wing feel Biden has moved the Democratic Party away from its previous allegiance to neoliberalism. It's done more than we might have expected on many domestic issues. But foreign policy and the question of peace and war and militarism are the deepest difference with the Biden administration. And within the foreign policy, Israel-Palestine is the most and hot button issue of all, one of the most. So the Gaza crisis moving front and center in the way it did has opened up a rift right within the anti-MAGA coalition that's been covered in the mainstream press and has started to grip communities across the country. So that's the landscape that we face going into October 7th. Just check off a few of the key developments since then. One, the demonstrations have been unprecedented in size, hundreds of thousands of people, the largest demonstrations for Palestine in U.S. history, and a potential revival of the peace movement, which the sponsors of this strategy session, the Peace Council, Massachusetts Peace Action. This is very important, not just for Israel-Palestine, but for revitalizing the peace and anti-militarist movements in the United States. What's also exceptional is this number of sectors that have weighed in on this. You have dissent right into the congressional staffers. You have dissent in the State Department. You have dissent in labor. The UAW endorsed the ceasefire yesterday, which is a very major step. You have intellectuals, artists, so on. So very broad, unprecedented mass action from below. The second point is, in contrast to previous periods where Israel-Palestine has been on, there's champions of the Palestinian side in Congress. The Rashida Tlaib, Cori Bush, and several of the other squad members have led the way, but we're now up to 47 Congress people and 3 senators in favor of an immediate permanent ceasefire. So we are present in the game in the halls of Congress, not just in the streets, and there's increasing coordination between some of the key groups on the ground doing the mass actions and the work within Congress. The third point I've already alluded to, the Biden administration embraced the Israeli position, and it still has that. The level of protests have made a difference. Over time, the Biden administration has been talking about its concern for Palestinian lives. They've made it clear that they think there needs to be an avenue for their preferred solution, a two-state solution, as opposed to Netanyahu's view. So there's a rift between the U.S. and Israel on that. They've pressured to extend the pause and the hostage thing. But there's been no action in terms of consequences to Israel, no threats to cut off support. It's been mostly a change in rhetoric. And this has been insufficient to satisfy those who feel that what's happening there is genocide, and the United States is enabling genocide. So there have been a whole series of polls, articles, and so on. James Zogby had a major piece in The Nation about the alienation from Biden around that. And all this takes place at a time when the Republican Party is openly genocidal about Palestine. There's not a peep of sympathy for the Palestinian side or the civilian deaths on Palestinian side in the Republican Party. They're in lockstep with the Israeli side, even leaving aside all the other ways in which Trump basically declaring everyone on this call not welcome in the United States. We're vermin infecting the body politic. So this is the landscape we're facing. It's very difficult, but there are some things we can take advantage of. One, very important, is a huge gap has opened up in the Democratic Party between the establishment elite and the base of the Democratic Party. Every poll shows substantial majorities of Democrats in favor of an immediate ceasefire and sympathy in general for the Palestinian cause. And that's reflected in the level of protests and in the broad sectors that are protesting. The future of Palestine solidarity, and for that matter, war and peace in general in the United States, depends on winning the fight in the Democratic Party to break the bipartisan consensus behind blank check support for Israel. Without winning that fight in the Democratic Party, we're not going to be able to change U.S. policy. But because of that gap right now, there is an opportunity to make some advances for Palestinian rights. That will involve continuing the mass actions, the civil disobedience. I'm here in Oakland, California. They blocked the Bay Bridge. They've taken over offices, the civil disobedience, as well as thousands, tens of thousands of people in the street. On the electoral front, AIPAC and the other right-wing forces, as well as the establishment pro-Zionist groups, have offered millions and millions of dollars to try to defeat especially the Squad and Rashida Tlaib in particular, but everyone who supported a ceasefire. National campaign to defend the people who supported a ceasefire is essential in the coming period. It can't be left only to the people in their districts in terms of we need to give money, we need to send volunteers to those places, and we can build an umbrella formation that keeps people involved and engaged all across the country in something that links fighting for Palestinian rights with the progressive agenda in general in Congress and the fight against the far right. In terms of the presidential candidate, going into October 7th, there were many grave doubts about Biden's capacity to carry the banner against Trump in 2024. Not for necessarily the same reasons that we're critical of him. Very important signal sent by David Axelrod, who was Obama's top strategist, tweeting that Biden should consider stepping down for the good of the country. The left cannot push Biden aside by ourselves. We don't have that power. But we can leverage the contradictions that exist within the elite, the concerns about Biden as a candidate, the fact that increasingly, even in the foreign policy establishment, there's grave worries about hitching U.S. policy completely to Netanyahu's leadership in Israel. We've seen massive protests across the globe. The United States is losing support and sympathy throughout the global South. And the people in Washington worry about that because they're concerned with U.S. hegemony globally. The Israelis don't worry about that. That's not on their map. Under those circumstances, a left challenge to Biden or other that indicate that there is a large number of people who defeat MAGA in the 2024 elections, but don't feel they can vote for Biden and would prefer somebody else, can lead to a situation similar to 1968, where Lyndon Johnson stepped aside. And had Robert Kennedy not been assassinated, the 1968 election might have gone very differently than it did. Those are the essential points of the arguments that I made in Convergence and Bill and I made in The Nation, and I'll stop there.
But who? Thanks, Max. And we can take a few questions. If you would raise your virtual hand or put your question in the chat. We can go for about 10 minutes, maybe 15 at most. Jeffrey, a question.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Max?
Yes.
I know this will be long, so I request your contact information so I can talk about my solution to the Israel-Palestinian solution with you personally. Is that okay?
Go right to your question, Jeff, please. We have several people wanting to ask. Make it snappy.
I was asking for his contact info so I could do that after the Zoom, so I can talk to him afterwards.
I'm going to mute you if you don't ask a question, Jeff.
Okay. Let me get it. Okay, let me just get to one. So what do you think the odds are that the country could be my idea of being reunified under a new name? What are the odds?
0. Okay, thanks for your question.
Paul, do you want me to address each one, or are we taking a stack?
Let's answer each question in turn. Jeff's asking if a one-state solution will work.
Well, I have no idea, honestly, of what the odds are of that. And I think that while many of us, I'm sure, I think it would be a very lively discussion about what specifically might be a solution there. Our main political task here is to change U.S. policy. And the question of how things work out over there is mostly dependent on the people there. Not that we don't have a say in that. But at this moment, I have to confess that I'm focused on trying to change U.S. policy. And while I find the discussions about potential solutions over there interesting, it's not my immediate political priority. And I've sort of resisted trying to go down that road and spend a lot of time calculating the different odds on the different solutions that have been proposed.
Hey, Michael, go ahead. Your question.
Yeah, my question deals with trying to maintain hegemony. So you said something about the Democratic Party concern is maintaining hegemony. And I hear a lot of people say that our empire is declining, but there's certain things that could be done to strengthen the hegemonic quest. So that's my concern is if we decline, that means one thing, and if we don't decline, that means something else. And can you go into that?
Well, right over the last many years and still today, U.S. hegemony world means for most people in the world a level of exploitation and oppression that makes them resist. It is different now than it was 30 or 40 years ago, in that much of the resistance is no longer led by the left, but is led by various chauvinistic or ethnic or theocratic-based movements. But it's still the case that the U.S. empire, whether strong or weak in certain places, is not a popular thing for people of the world. So there's resistance. And the U.S. is trying to balance and maintain that hegemony against that resistance and against rival powers like China or Russia. And they are concerned with both soft power and hard power and alliances. And the Israel-Palestine conflict, the sympathies of most people in the world, and even most governments, even many reactionary governments, is with the Palestinians, because they identify with the people who've been colonized and put under with the Western imperial behind them. So the U.S. wants to find a solution in the Middle East that defuses the opposition to the United States. And they're prepared to make all kinds of concessions that the current government of Israel, or actually previous governments, have been unprepared to make.
Great, thanks. Let's go to Alan.
This is interesting. It's about Palestine.
Alan?
Hey, Max, how you doing? Alan Minsky here.
Yeah, hi, Alan.
Hey, so I'm putting into the chat, on tomorrow's town hall, we have Omer Bartov as our guest, as our featured guest. And I've actually been very impressed with what I've seen from him since this conflict broke out. I saw him on Democracy Now! On November 10th. And then he just on the 29th, they published a piece of his. He actually wrote for another place as a lead editorial in The Guardian. But in particular, I am bringing him on because I was intrigued by what he called sort of a 1.5 state solution, or between a 1 and 2 state solution, a confederated state solution. But in the Guardian article, and here's the thing, and this goes exactly to what you said, Max. He writes, hold on a second, got it right here, that what is essential, the only way out of the current conundrum is for Israel to declare that it seeks a peaceful resolution of the conflict with an appropriate and willing Palestinian leadership. Okay, Israel's not going to do that. We sort of know that with the current government. The United States, however, and progressives could demand that take place. And given the United States' oversized role in influencing the situation, obviously, as Israel's prime backer, you would think we'd have leverage on Israel to demand that they renew negotiations for a resolution to the broad crisis and conflict of Israel and Palestine. I think that's wise, and I think it's a thing that progressives could lean into. So your thoughts on that, and then maybe hopefully you can join us tomorrow, and everybody here. I'd love for this audience to catch what Bartov has to say and see what they think about it, and the registration is in the chat. Your thoughts, Max?
Bartov's work is very impressive, and it's great that you're doing that session tomorrow. I think that the next, there was an article that said the ceasefire has to be a first step toward justice in Israel-Palestine. And I think that if we can win a ceasefire, what happens then is that the more advanced stages of what we can demand, what's the next transitional demand, come to the fore. I think our long-range demand is equal rights for everybody in that period. In that, I mean, we believe in equal rights, human rights around the world. What form that takes gets extremely more complicated. Is are worth considering, just like whatever the ones Jeffrey was going to advocate, if they provide for equal rights for everybody living in that area. The next step might be conditioning USA. The next step might be, some kind of international peace conference that is being called. People have been advocating. The Spanish premier has argued for that. And exactly how we approach those things, I think, comes up on the agenda. Very lively and important discussion.
Very quick follow-up, but just in terms of when Bartov says that, and we know Israel's not going to do that, just for your thinking, you also framed everything you said around the prospects for progressives, the left in America. It seems to me, and I don't mean to be cynically exploiting this horrific, just absolutely horrible situation, but it strikes me that that kind of policy demand from progressives would be a majority political position for the population and a winning position for us as PDA and all progressives to ask progressive politicians to pursue heading into the election cycle. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, right now, to oppose Israeli domination, you don't have to be a radical or an anti-Zionist. You just have to be against genocide. So absolutely, people's minds are open, I think will be open to the kind of thing you're talking about, much more than they have been in the past. And the gap between the elite, where the propaganda has been so great, and we have to, and the mass, when AIPAC goes after pro-Palestinian congresspeople, it doesn't even say it's about Israel. they go after them and give them fortune, and they try to find some other issue to attack them on. So I think we can, over time, build a majoritarian coalition for equal rights in the Middle East, and a change in U.S. foreign policy generally, away from military solutions to what are political injustice problems.
So my question is, in terms of actualizing a project like this in U.S. politics, we're looking at 3, 4, 5 months to make a difference. What are the steps that are necessary? And I'd also be interested in Massachusetts people, your comments on, do we primary Jake Auchincloss? Who can we recruit to run? Another project I'll just mention, I guess Biden is going to be here on Tuesday for a fundraiser in Boston. James Taylor is going to serenade him. There's a call out from If Not Now to try to get Taylor to drop it. But if Taylor doesn't drop it, we'll see what else can be done on Tuesday. But what are the tactics? What are the steps, Max?
Well, some are easier than others, or at least more apparent than others. One step is to prime people that we shouldn't be fatalistic that the next election has to be Biden versus Trump, that there's a lot of time to go. And we need to have people thinking outside the box. The second thing is, in terms of defense of the Congress people, there's already a groundswell, people just spontaneously supporting and giving money to the squad and other people like that. There's projects like the See the Vote project, which deploys people from blue states into swing states or swing districts to canvass when election time comes along, under the leadership of grassroots groups in power building groups in particular states. And I think we have to start building up those kinds of projects and be prepared to send resources in Democratic primaries wherever people who supported the ceasefire are being under attack by being primaried by folks who are financed by AIPAC and other forces. So I think those kinds of things can start to be done right away. And PDA, that Alan's here, some of the other groups, Our Revolution, Working Families Party, are all, there's a Justice Dems that are already moving in that kind of direction. So this is something that's popular. On the presidential level, it's more complicated. The filing deadlines have passed for some states already. There are people talking to people and trying to see if somebody wants to step up and say, I'll run a campaign against Biden around this with a message that says a number of good things. He beat Trump in 2020. We're not going to bash him. He moved the Democratic Party in certain positive directions on domestic issues, but he should step aside. Because he's not a winner right now. He should go out a winner instead of going down in history as somebody who might have lost what's left of our democracy to Trump. So we need to get that kind of messaging together. There's, I think, a discussion of tactics beyond a candidate challenge leading up to the convention. There's ways to influence high-level people in the Democratic Party who might, under certain circumstances, have the kind of tough love conversation with Biden that we'd like to have, and try to change things in that regard. So I think those are some of the concrete steps that can be done right away.
Great. Well, thank you, Max, for laying this out and getting us started on this thought process. And I hope it's a discussion that will continue. How do we bring the Gaza motion into the presidential or the political arena in 2024? Seems very, very important.
Cole, can I jump in just before Russell?
Go ahead, Henry.
Right. So because I've been with all of you all day, I want to appreciate your presence, and to see so many of you who were here at the beginning, still here at the end. That's a testimony to your dedication, but also to the quality of the presentations and the discussions. I think it was really valuable. We want to get your feedback. You'll get a request for feedback, an actual form. We need that because when we do this again next year, which I certainly hope we do, we need to have even a better conference and twice as many people attending. Those are some goals. I want to just say a couple of things that were striking for me about what I heard today. One is the importance of trade unions in the success of much that we did. That came out in many of the presentations, and I think it's underappreciated. Second, the importance of struggling for a lasting ceasefire. We've got one of the squad members right here. We've got Biden coming to Boston. We've got a particular responsibility. Third, the importance of defeating fascism. That's a real threat. And fourth, getting out the vote. We haven't figured out how we can participate in that in a significant way. We've got to do it. We've got to find ways to participate also in local elections and build a bench. And finally, I just want to point down in the chat, the next MPAOC event will be a housing forum because there's so much that's important here that we couldn't get to today. That's January 10th, and that's in the chat. And now over to Russell.
Hi, everybody. I want to thank you all who stuck around through a long and emotional day. I want to extend our special thanks to the speakers, breakout leaders, and everyone who's made the day possible, especially Cole and the map of people who handled all the difficult technical stuff. And basically, it went better and better year by year. So thank you very much, Cole and Brian.
We still haven't achieved perfection.
Well, we're getting there. There's so much to be done, so much that needs to be fixed. Some years ago, I was at a talk when someone asked Bill McKibben, what can an individual do to combat climate change? And his reply was, don't be an individual person. Join a group, work with others. MPAOC is a coalition of Massachusetts statewide political and community organizations formed to increase progressive political power. We aim to support progressive candidates and progressive legislation and increase the unity and clarity of the progressive movement. We're Incorruptible Mass, Mass Peace Action, North American Indian Center of Boston, Our Revolution, Massachusetts, Progressive Democrats of America, and Progressive Massachusetts. If we all join together, we can make a difference. We can move this state and country forward towards a more humane future. Once again, thank you all for spending the day with us. If you would like to comment on the conference, I think Henry has put the comment sheet in the chat. I've also put the Linktree link in the chat as well. So please fill out the evaluation form. Thank you all again for coming, and onward we go.